Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. We have a very packed show for today. We're going to start off talking about a little bit of Super Bowl. Of course, we have to, with this being Super Bowl week. So I'm going to be going through my list of people that have the most to gain from a Super Bowl win on Sunday. Then in the second segment, I'm going to be giving my picks for the NFL regular season awards that will be announced tonight at 9 o'clock. So I'm going to be giving my picks, but also at that same rate, I am going to be giving my predictions because I don't think they will all fall exactly linear. Then in the second half of the show, we are going to be loaded with NBA trade deadline updates. The deadline is taking place at 3 o'clock today. So as this show goes on, we're going to be having news breaking at the moment. We're going to try and keep up with everything that we can. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to please like and follow. And for any sort of tips and donations, just a reminder to use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker throughout the course of the show. That is streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip. So without further ado, getting into our first segment here, who has the most to gain from a Super Bowl win? I put together a list of 5+ names here that I think would benefit the most. The first of which being Kyle Shanahan, the head coach of the 49ers. Shanahan, someone that we have talked a lot about on this show. It is no doubt he is an incredible offensive mind, and despite that, he's had a fair amount of criticism because, really when he first got sort of thrown into the fire of national media attention came with the 28-3 collapse when he was the offensive coordinator for the Falcons when they blew the lead in the Super Bowl. And ever since then, I think that he's gotten a little bit of an unfair reputation as a choker, as somebody who can't win big games, and as somebody who has struggled with the idea of coming back in the past. Now, during their playoff run this year, they've already sort of put to rest, maybe not fully to rest, but put some of the doubters to the side, at least for the time being, when it comes to the lead perspective of this. He was 0-40, I believe it was, one of those horrendous stats talking about his record when his team trailed by 7 or more points entering the fourth quarter. And now he has one of those wins this postseason, and additionally has the largest comeback in NFC Championship game history. Now, that didn't actually end up being considered one of those statistical games because they actually did a lot of their comeback in the third quarter. So they weren't trailing by 7 or more come the fourth quarter, but an unbelievable comeback nonetheless. And during that NFC Championship game, especially at halftime, I think that everybody really that follows the sport was sort of preparing to come up with their different takes about Shanahan coming flat in the postseason again. I know that I was texting with some people in a group chat about a Kyle Shanahan falling flat again in the playoffs to end their season, but that was not the case as they were able to come back. So he sort of kept the dream alive, and as a result, now they're playing for another Super Bowl with a chance to redeem themselves and for Shanahan himself to redeem himself from the other big blown lead of his career, which was in the Super Bowl all those years ago against a very similar Chiefs roster. You know the deal. Allowed 21 straight points in the fourth quarter while being shut out to lose that game. So Shanahan, I think, has the most to gain from a Super Bowl win here, really establish himself as not just one of the great offensive minds, not just one of the great young head coaches, but really one of the top tier coaches as a whole in the league. And he probably already is a couple of those things at least, but I think that he can really put the doubts to rest if they are able to pull it off in a year where they are going in with Mr. Irrelevant, Brock Purdy, who I have as second on my list here as far as who has the most to gain. Purdy has had no shortage of doubters throughout his short career so far, despite the amount of success from a team perspective that they have had. And Purdy had his name in MVP considerations for a lot of the year as well. Sort of died down late in the year when they lost to the Ravens, but nonetheless, he was in that conversation. He was playing really well. There were some injuries going on around him, but he kept this 49ers team chugging along, and they end up with the 1 seed and in the best possible situation to make another Super Bowl run. And here he is. I think that for the most part, as far as financially going forward, unless things go really wrong for him in the Super Bowl, I think he's already locked himself down at least some form of a long-term contract. Now, he can definitely up the price on that with a good Super Bowl performance, but unless things go horribly, I think he's got that locked down. So I think what he has to gain is more from the respect aspect of it all, because even despite the amount of success that he has had, I think that people just really hang on to that draft status being the last overall pick a couple years ago. And it's not like we have the biggest body of work. It has been just 2 big seasons. And, up until NFC Championship weekend, he was injured for the biggest moment of his career, which I would argue was the NFC Championship game last year. And he left early in that, and we didn't even get to see how he showed up and how he delivered in that moment. And even this playoff run, the 49ers haven't looked tremendous through the first couple rounds, but again, they did enough to get here, and that's sort of been the thing with Purdy, is can he be a good enough game manager to just keep them in the game and allow them to have those moments to strike, and that's what he's done up to this point. I think that, he's also probably just about the person with the most to lose should this game go sideways for them. But I think that in the very same sense, there's a lot of people that are on that Brock Purdy line of, is he a franchise guy? Is he a product of the system? And this game is going to weigh very heavily in that argument. Number 3 on my list, I have a little bit of a joint answer here between Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. They are sort of in the same boat, in my opinion, the same tier, because they have very similar legacy stuff going on in this game. They are both future Hall of Famers. That's pretty much non-negotiable at this point. But we obviously know how accomplished these guys are, and I think that, so just like looking at the list of names they could put themselves with here, Mahomes is looking to be a 3-time Super Bowl winner, 2-time MVP, very elite group there. It would be one of 5 people, one of 5 quarterbacks, I should say, to win a Super Bowl, with Brady, Terry Bradshaw, Joe Montana, and Troy Aikman. As for Andy Reid, he would join Bill Belichick, Chuck Noll, Bill Walsh, and Joe Gibbs. So reaching an unheard of feat, really. I shouldn't say unheard of, but pretty much immortal in terms of, NFL history and legendary status. And they are both very likely to sort of be in that stratosphere as it is. But for Mahomes, it's one thing. he's younger. I think that he probably has more room to grow in terms of his legacy argument because he's already up there so much. He has a chance of reaching the Tom Brady, Joe Montana tier. He's just about there, if not already in that area as it is. Andy Reid, he has been so accomplished through his entire career. He's now sort of on the back end of it. There have been speculations of whether or not he would retire after this season. So for him, I don't think that he is going to retire after this season, but sort of making his final pushes here to enter himself in that, again, almost immortal status among NFL head coaches in the history of the sport. So I put them together here. Again, I think Mahomes would have slightly more to gain, but it's pretty much the same argument for either one of them. So I think ultimately placing them together on this list was just the direction I decided to go with. Number 4 on my list, I have Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey's very interesting here because, typically when we see these types of things, we see quarterbacks, we see head coaches, we see more traditional decision makers being placed in this sort of light because that's just sort of what we do as NFL fans a lot of the time, is put all of it on the shoulders of, one guy, the guy that has the ball the most in his hands, or the head coach who runs the entire operation. But Christian McCaffrey, I think, has a lot to gain from this game. He is almost one of the last of a dying breed, and I don't fully want to say that because who knows what the future has in store. But if you look at where we are in 2024 and the typical value that is associated with running backs, it's obviously at an all-time low. And because of that, there's this whole argument about how much they should get paid. And, I was just on the GSMC football podcast earlier today, and we were talking about Saquon Barkley, me and Kenneth, the host of the show, and there's no denying the talent that is there with Barkley, but it's just a matter of there are so many other positions that you have to take care of first before you can heavily invest into a running back just based off of the positional value in a league today that is so much more pass happy, obviously. And McCaffrey has almost defied the typical expectations and views on value of a running back ever since he has joined this 49ers team at the trade deadline last year. I think that he has been so crucial for them in a little bit a catalyst of taking them to that next level of a contender. Now, yes, obviously they made the Super Bowl, the 49ers, that is, a few years ago without him, without Brock Purdy. So the system is still great. You had Debo in that one, and there are a lot of pieces that are still in place there, but I think that McCaffrey has just added, he was the ultimate weapon to add into this system that Kyle Shanahan is trying to execute. And well, you had sort of stopgap guys that were productive for them. I think that it's a different level with McCaffrey because throughout the past 2 weeks, you kind of have to imagine that Steve Spagnuolo and the Kansas City Chiefs' whole defense, really, from coaching staff to players, has had their eyes fixated on Christian McCaffrey. Obviously, there are other weapons too, and the skill position guys in particular, Debo is another one of these versatile guys that I'm sure they're also going to be keying in on, but especially considering the fact that during the regular season, the Chiefs weren't a great run-stopping defense, and they've stepped up their game some in the playoffs, but the Ravens didn't really try to. The Bills had a lot of success on the ground for the first 75% of that game, and this does sort of seem like it could be the weak link for the Chiefs defense is a running back like Christian McCaffrey. We talked about it on the show yesterday. In my opinion, he is the best running back in the league. And when I say dying breed, it's just like a little bit of, what does it take to be a Hall of Fame caliber running back in today's age, the way that running backs are used? Because careers are very short, so it's hard to get the longevity aspect of it. You're sort of tossed away a lot of the time after your rookie contract. But Christian McCaffrey has had the ability to make an impact even back when he was with Carolina. And I think that he has, whether the Chiefs are able to focus in on him, key in on him in the Super Bowl and try and take him out of the game, his presence being there alone is so valuable to the Niners that I think that he has a chance to really establish himself as potentially an all-time great when it comes to running backs. It's him and Derrick Henry sort of in a class of their own right now as far as guys that seem like they have real Hall of Fame potential. And, he could go down as one of the most memorable running backs of the 2000s. So I have McCaffrey at 4. And then number 5, just to wrap up this segment, I had both GMs actually from the 49ers and from the Chiefs. I think that, it hasn't been necessarily the easiest road to get here. I think that John Lynch is very well renowned across the league as one of the best general managers in the game of football. And I do very much agree with that. I think that the amount of talent that he's been able to put on that roster, the drafting, although it's not him alone, they always just have the best linebackers. They have a lot of talent on both sides of the ball. And Lynch that is very successful. He had one of the biggest blunders in recent draft history in the 2021 draft when they traded 3 first-round picks and a third for the 3rd overall pick in that 2021 draft that would end up being Trey Lance, who only started 4 games for them. And I think that what makes this move so much worse is the fact that when they did this, they didn't even know who they were going to be taking at 3. And I feel like when you're mortgaging all this to get a draft position, you have to at least know, like, there's a big risk that you take running with the draft day trades or the, days leading up to the draft. But you have to be able to confidently say that this is the right move because we're getting this guy. It is worth it. They didn't even know who they were going with then. And yet, despite giving up as much as they did, they were still able to bounce back, and they've made 2 straight NFC championship appearances and now a Super Bowl. On the Chiefs side, Brett Veach, he made a very gutsy move of trading Tyreek Hill at the peak of his powers, sending him to Miami when that was never even seen as a possibility really up until that moment. But he understood the value of Travis Kelce at the time, knowing that you were going to have to rebuild other parts of this roster around the massive contract that you were giving out to Patrick Mahomes. And, he also got ahead of this Mahomes deal, signing him for 10 years. And at that point, it was probably a no-brainer, but we don't see 10-year contracts in the NFL like that. And there was some risk to it, I suppose, but he didn't flinch. And ultimately, it was clearly the right decision. They have a chance to win back-to-back Super Bowls after moving on from one of the best, if not the best, wide receiver in the game. So that is the list that I have. We are going to be taking a quick break, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be previewing the NFL honors, which take place tonight. So stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Just wrapped up giving my top 5 people that have the most to gain from a Super Bowl win. Sticking with some NFL, the NFL honors will be presented tonight. So I'm going to be giving my opinions on each award as well as my predictions. I don't think they all fully line up, but award show takes place tonight at 9 o'clock. So should be interesting. I think that a lot of these probably aren't all too debatable, but I think that there's still going to be controversy, at least around a couple of them. There's one in particular that I think is very contentious. So we will start off with the MVP award. The finalists are Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Christian McCaffrey, Dak Prescott, and Brock Purdy. I think that we all pretty much have known for about a month now that it is Lamar Jackson. This was a very strange MVP race, in my opinion. I feel like it just bounced around a lot. Week to week, we were considering a different person for it. There was the list of I just named really are the ones that stick out in particular between Dak Prescott, Brock Purdy, and Christian McCaffrey. But it just never seemed like there was all that too convincing of a name. Tyreek Hill was in that conversation, I think, for a while. This was, if it's not going to be a position player this year, I don't know if we're ever really going to see one again, because I think that Christian McCaffrey could have been very deserving for this. Now, specifically, this all sort of ended when the Ravens pummeled the 49ers on primetime later in the season, and that's pretty much when it was wrapped up for Lamar Jackson. But I think McCaffrey had a great argument for a lot of the year. Tyreek Hill did as well, but Tyreek ended up going down with injury for a bit there, and his numbers sort of fell off some. So yeah, I think that we just sort of have to come to grips with the fact that this is a quarterback award, and I think we mostly have at this point. We're maybe 10 years since the last time a non-quarterback has won. It was probably Adrian Peterson in 2012, unless I'm misremembering, but that's fine. It is the most valuable position. I think that we can sort of acknowledge that. And a lot of the time, it's going to be the best quarterback on the most successful team. I would like to maybe point out the fact that their defense was so dominant, Baltimore, this year, that, in some of these, they were never really tested all that hard during the regular season. And that's not a bad thing. It was, the Lions when the Ravens stomped all over them, and Lamar had a good rushing game in that game. They ran all over the Lions, and the Seahawks were seen as a threat at one point. And again, this Niners win happened, so I'm not trying to take anything away from Lamar. I just feel like, not all MVPs are necessarily built equal in terms of the weight behind them. I know at the end of the day, it just goes on your resume as an MVP award, but I don't think that the competition necessarily was all too convincing, and just based on how the year played out. But it is going to be Lamar. It should be Lamar. So really, ultimately, no big problems there. Offensive Player of the Year, is easily Christian McCaffrey to me. Like I was saying, I thought that he should have gotten real MVP consideration, and while that isn't going to happen, it has to be him for this. I never really understand the difference sometimes when they go MVP versus Offensive Player of the Year. Sometimes they're the same winner, sometimes they're not, but I know that it should be McCaffrey in this one. The finalists are Tyreek, Lamar Jackson, CeeDee Lamb, Christian McCaffrey, Dak Prescott. Again, it's sort of weird the way that we distinguish an MVP and Offensive Player of the Year award versus sort of being separate things. But I think this is probably the fair way to divvy it out, is Lamar with the MVP, Christian McCaffrey with the Offensive Player of the Year. So I don't know if any of you have better ideas than I do in terms of the difference. That's something I'm definitely going to have to look into. Defensive Player of the Year. This is the one where I think it is going to be a lot of dialogue behind, because in my opinion, the two front runners for the award are division rivals, play the same position. That is between Myles Garrett and TJ Watt. It is them along with Deron Bland, Micah Parsons, and Max Crosby for the Defensive Player of the Year award here as the finalists. Just as a side note, he had a great season, but Deron Bland being up here because he had a handful of pick sixes, and you know what? It's putting points on the board for your team from a defensive position. So there's obviously value to that, but I was very surprised to see that he was a finalist. I don't think he's that level of a shutdown cornerback. I think, interceptions are just always such an interesting sort of way to evaluate cornerbacks alone. And yes, it's helpful, but, we had Trayvon Diggs a few years ago allowing historical receiving yards, but also grabbing historical interceptions. So, it's just weird how that works, and that's why it's so hard for cornerbacks, I feel like, to win Defensive Player of the Year. Shout out Stephon Gilmore, though, with his year on the Patriots. So, as to the debate between these two players in particular, it's really tough, because if you look at these statistics across the board, TJ Watt has Myles Garrett beat in just about everything. 19 sacks is an incredible feat. And also the fact that if you sort of want to look bigger picture, I always have this little internal debate with myself of how much are wins actually quarterback stats. Wins are definitely not defensive end stats, but the Steelers are so much worse when he is not playing versus when he's playing. Since he's been drafted, I believe the Steelers are 1-10 in games that TJ Watt doesn't play in. He seems to really have this level of value to their team, to their defense, obviously, and it's kind of hard to overcome that. Now, what's interesting is the way that if you get into some of these more advanced analytics, the way that Myles Garrett, he was double teamed the second most in the NFL this season. Micah Parsons also, by the way, I don't really have him in consideration for this award, although he definitely deserves to be a finalist, and I don't think it would be any sort of an atrocity if he did win. But I think these other two guys are maybe just a step above them. And, Micah Parsons is also very young. None of these guys are old necessarily, but Micah Parsons still very young, has plenty of time to win the Defensive Player of the Year award. TJ Watt won it last season, but there's a very large section of people on the internet that think you're stupid if you aren't looking into the double team rates and the pass rush win rate that Myles Garrett does beat TJ Watt in. And, it's funny because at eye level, I feel like a lot of people who just sort of casually enjoy football, it can be a little reliant on counting stats. And there's a portion of people that think that sacks are an overrated stat in comparison to QB hits, QB knockdowns, QB pressures, all of that stuff, where TJ Watt still does sort of win in a lot of these categories, pressures by a significant amount. But I also think that you can't overlook the fact of it's one thing to put pressure on someone, just look at Patrick Mahomes, just look at Lamar Jackson, versus actually taking them down. And finishing the play, I think, is a very significant thing that, again, I'm speaking to a very particular few, I feel like, when it comes to this debate of what are the most valuable defensive stats. I still don't have a necessarily definitive answer. I just think you have to look at everything as a whole, and you can't just cherry pick particular stats. That being said, I don't feel super strongly either way. I feel like I'm supposed to feel bad about going with TJ Watt, but I would pick TJ Watt, even though I think that Myles Garrett is the favorite as of this morning, and there's a very good chance that he wins it. Would be deserved. But I just feel like Browns and Steelers fans are going to be, one of them's going to be very mad one way or another, and that's the one that's going to shake the internet the most, I think. Offensive Rookie of the Year award, I don't really think there's much of an option but to choose CJ Stroud in this instance. He was incredible for them all year long. He had his name somewhat in MVP consideration at one point during the season, especially before he got hurt, but he was great. An example of somebody who not just came in and played the position, but he elevated everybody around him. He took Nico Collins to another level. He took Devin Singletary to another level. I know that offensive line was also good too, and Singletary was moving to a system that trusts him a little bit more as a go-to back, but Tank Dell was great as well. CJ Stroud, because of just the big picture thing here, he has to be in it. Now, Puka Nacua deserves, obviously, a ton of credit, breaks the rookie receptions record, and he really helped, especially during the time that Cooper Kupp was dealing with his injuries. He helped carry that Rams offense. And, you know, I love hearing some of the behind-the-scenes stories about how there's always been this sort of breakfast club, it's called, between Sean McVay, Matthew Stafford, and Cooper Kupp. And the fact that Puka was just so excited, or eager, I should say, more so than excited, to be a part of this, to learn as much as possible. He was just a perfect addition to this offense that is very nuanced, and I think there's a lot of brilliant NFL minds within that offense, and that's why McVay was so excited at the time. There was some clips that came out of his reaction when the GM drafted Puka, and as a result, he put together an incredible season. It's almost unfortunate that he can't win this, and not that he can't and there's no chance, but it's going to be CJ Stroud, and CJ Stroud deserves it. But for a fifth-round receiver to come out and put together the type of season Puka did and help bring real value to that team, he deserves a ton of credit and recognition as well. If you were curious, the other finalists for this are Jahmyr Gibbs, Sam Laporta, and Bijan Robinson. Interesting with Bijan. But, you know, I'm not going to get into all of that. Defensive Rookie of the Year, it is Will Anderson, Jalen Carter, Joey Porter Jr., Kobe Turner, and Devin Witherspoon as the finalists. I think this is another really good conversation. Another one where you can kind of go with a couple different answers here, and I don't think you would be wrong necessarily, but I do sort of stand out in, I have a sort of definitive opinion, but again, it's not like I'm stating a fact here. I think that if Jalen Carter or Devin Witherspoon won this award, I wouldn't really bat an eye. I think it would be totally acceptable, but I personally would pick Will Anderson Jr. I think he was so incredible this year. Just the way that this all sort of played out. Jalen Carter came into the scenes early in the spotlight. This was a guy who was potentially going to go number one before the incident that took place during the Georgia parade. He ends up falling a bit to the Eagles, team that had just won the NFC Championship, and everybody is freaking out. How did we let this guy fall as far as he did? He had 7 QB hits in his first 8 games with 4 sacks during that stretch. He was incredible. Baby Rhino, I believe, is what he was called. And he still is phenomenal, but he sort of disappeared down the second half of the season. Now, the Eagles struggled a lot as a group as a whole on the defensive side of the ball during that second half stretch, so obviously hard to put it solely on the shoulders of their first round pick. But I think on the other end, Will Anderson, the trajectory that he was on, and he just kept getting better and better as the year went on. I thought it was so impressive. You know, you have to consider the positional differences when you're talking about these two guys, but he finished with more QB hurries, QB knockdowns, pressures, sacks, and tackles than Jalen Carter did. This is Will Anderson. He was also third in the NFL in pass rush win rate, and he did all of this in one less game than Carter. But I also think that part of what plays into this for me is Will Anderson is an every down guy. Jalen Carter, even dating back to Georgia, he was never really a 3-4 down guy. Comes off the field a lot, and down the stretch, he played during his final 5 regular season games. Jalen Carter, he played over 50% of the defensive snaps only once. Again, a little bit of positional stuff there, but maybe a little bit of an unfair comparison. Aaron Donald is not playing just under 50%. I even went back and checked just to be sure. Aaron Donald only had 1 game under 60% of snaps all season, comparing him to the greatest interior lineman of all time, basically. So not super fair, but I just think that Will Anderson deserves the recognition of Defensive Rookie of the Year. And last 2 awards here, quickly on them. Comeback Player of the Year. Finalists are Joe Flacco, Damar Hamlin, Baker Mayfield, Matthew Stafford, Tua Tagovailoa. I think it has to be Damar Hamlin. And it's very interesting the way that NFL fans sort of act when it comes to this conversation, because a lot of people act like it's this super prestigious award, but we're talking about Comeback Player of the Year. It's really not that deep. This award maybe shouldn't even exist. I don't really care for it in the first place. And Damar Hamlin, this is the award almost. It's like a recognition award for doing something spectacular. In the MLB last season, Liam Hendriks of the Chicago White Sox came back from being diagnosed with cancer in December. He was determined to play. He pitched for 5 innings in 5 appearances. Then he was shut down with a separate injury. I believe he got Tommy John surgery. But MLB fans celebrated this guy coming back from cancer. And now we have NFL fans who are appalled at the idea of this guy who only played in 5 games couldn't win the Comeback Player of the Year award. I mean, that's just sort of insane to me. It's pretty cynical. Like, the guy's heart stopped beating, and he came back and he was not scared to keep playing. And sure, it was his livelihood, and, you know, it's not that simple. Like, this was a very big deal. Everyone's going to remember the moment Damar Hamlin on primetime television literally stopped living. And, you know, he came back from that and played, and sure, he wasn't the best player ever, but we're going to be remembering that moment far more than we're going to be remembering, you know, any particular moment from Baker or Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco endorsed Damar Hamlin for this award as well. I don't think it should be this big of a controversy, but I know there are a lot of people who like to just get riled up to get riled up. So this should be Damar Hamlin. Final thoughts here, because we are running out of time on this segment. I have Kevin Stefanski as the Coach of the Year. D'Amico Ryans is also incredibly deserving himself, but I think that just with the injuries at quarterback, also losing Nick Chubb, one of the best running backs in the NFL early in the year, and dealing with everything they were dealing with at that quarterback position to stay strong. And I know he's not in charge of the defense necessarily from a play calling standpoint or anything like that, but he kept this team afloat. I thought that he did a really good job down the second half of the season, putting together a scheme that Joe Flacco could excel in, getting David Njoku more involved, and they ended up on a pretty hot streak for what could have been a miserable season for them. Other finalists, in case you were curious, Dan Campbell, John Harbaugh, Kyle Shanahan, but I think this should be Kevin Stefanski because he overcame the most adversity in my opinion. So we are going to be taking another break. When we come back on the other side, we are going to get into the NBA trade deadline craze that is currently going on as we speak. So stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Just finished off our NFL thoughts for the day. Moving on to the NBA as we are creeping up, now currently 18 minutes away from the NBA trade deadline. There's been a lot of movement today. We're going to cover, if we have time, some of the moves that went on live during the show yesterday that I've had a little more time to think over. But we're going to go almost a little rapid fire to get through as many of these deals as possible because no, it's not maybe necessarily the superstar power that we had at last year's trade deadline. There are a lot of moves and a lot of real contending teams are trying to bolster their rosters. I've liked a couple of these deals so far. So getting into it here, we will start with the New York Knicks, who made a deal with the Detroit Pistons. They acquired Bojan Bogdanovic and Alec Burks from the Pistons. The Knicks were sort of been talking about trying to move the Evan Fournier contract. Fournier has a just about $19 million contract with a player option or a team option for next season. So essentially an expiring contract, and they had been trying to use that cap space to be able to match it with another significant contributing player. They end up going with Bogdanovic, who I think is a great player. I've been talking about him on the show these past few days about how he can definitely help contribute to a contender, and now he gets this chance as the Knicks definitely get better from this move. They move off of the Fournier contract, of course. Quentin Grimes, Malachi Flynn, Ryan Arcidiacono, and 2 second-round picks. Sad to see the Villanova Knicks sort of falling apart here a little bit with Arcidiacono on the move. But other than that, this is a very good move for the Knicks, in my opinion. You know, they had sort of been struggling with depth, specifically at the guard position. Now, Quentin Grimes and Deuce McBride have both been playing very good basketball for them, but I think that Alec Burks can come off the bench, and I mean, he had a great night last night. He scored 20-plus points in the Pistons' surprising win on the road against the Sacramento Kings, so not a bad move. For the Pistons here, specifically first referring to the sort of Alec Burks situation with this. I didn't like Alec Burks because this was a young team trying to find themselves, and because of that, Alec Burks sort of came in a little more experienced, a little more of a veteran, and he sort of started forcing the issue a little bit more, especially with a coach in Monty Williams, who I don't think had a great grasp on the situation and the locker room in terms of what are the best steps for this team to take moving forward. Really stunted those Jaden Ivey minutes early in the year, and Jaden Ivey with a career high last night. We're not doing a Pistons segment right now, but I think that, Burks coming off the bench for the Knicks is a nice addition just to supply some bench scoring, and this is obviously a very good defensive team with the Knicks. Bogdanović, he's not necessarily an elite defender, but he's got tons of size, and he's got that shot making that, we've sort of seen so far this season in times where it is just Jalen Brunson. The other teams will sort of just double him and try and make other people beat them, and it hasn't been super successful up to this point. I think that Bogdanović adds another real scoring option for them going forward, and I like this move a lot for them. I don't think that they had to give up all too much, didn't even give up a first-round pick in this. It's funny how second-round picks have just developed into the ultimate trade chip in this, where you don't feel bad about it, but all these middling teams sort of love eating them up. It's a funny thing, I feel like, the way that we've seen second-round picks be used in trades the past couple years. The 76ers made a trade to acquire Buddy Hield earlier this week. I was talking about if I am the 76ers, the main thing I'm doing is trying to look for guys that I am going to control going forward past this season. Now, Buddy Hield is an expiring contract, but you have to imagine that they are probably going to look to re-sign him. I mean, Buddy Hield is a very underrated basketball player, in my opinion. He really didn't like the role that he was given with the Pacers. There was a little bit of friction there, but now he gets to come into an area where I think he should be getting big minutes. I think that he's someone that should be able to play very well off of Tyrese Maxey and just sort of almost seamlessly fit into what the 76ers are trying to plan going forward. Now, still interesting, we'll see what happens as far as them re-signing him here, and we'll still have to see what the updates are on Joel Embiid's injury as time comes, but I think that it's probably a best of both worlds situation where you don't have to feel too bad if you are the 76ers that you didn't give up very much. It was Marcus Morris, Furkan Korkmaz, and 3 second-round picks. Here we go with those second-round picks again. But, it was pretty minimal. Korkmaz and Marcus Morris were both expiring contracts themselves as well. You don't really care about those second-round picks if you are Philly. So, able to move on from all of that, get a player that should help to contributing now, whether that is this season or next. Again, I assume they're going to be looking to re-sign him to a contract, but we will keep you updated on that. The Suns made a trade that I really liked, actually. They went through with a 3-team deal with the Brooklyn Nets and the Memphis Grizzlies. They bring in Royce O'Neal and David Roddy. The return, I still haven't had a chance because this went on right before we went on air, so I haven't gotten to fully look over the return package, or what they're sending out, I should say. I know Yuta Watanabe is a part of that deal, but it sounds like the Suns didn't have to give up all too much. Royce O'Neal is a really good stretch. He's not a big necessarily. He's like a 3. He's a 4. He's got some size. He can really shoot for you. He can play good enough defense. And David Roddy sort of also fits into that category. I mean, the Suns, when they played the Bucks the other night, they were throwing Bol on the court, trying to sort of match that size with Giannis. I didn't think it was going great necessarily, but now they sort of bring in some reinforcements, and I really like this move because I think that this is what I've been talking about with the Suns is I think that they're just a little too top heavy. They are still, very good, obviously. And when their top 3 players are playing, it's great. And I like the pieces that can come off the bench for them. I don't want to have to necessarily run through them all again, but Grayson Allen's having a great year. He's actually starting for them. Nurkic is having a good year. But then they have guys coming off the bench like Eric Gordon, Chimezie Metu, Keita Bates-Diop, Josh Okogie. Like, these are good enough guys that can get in a rotation for you. But if you have to ask them to play starter minutes, it gets a lot more iffy. And the Suns, come free agency, based off of how much money they had tied into their starting group, they didn't really have much flexibility at all to go get other guys. So it was a lot of minimum contracts around. And now this is bringing in, I think, a little more talent to help solidify that bench even more. I would imagine, I don't know the full financial consequences of this deal. Again, I'll have a more in-depth probably review of all these moves for the show tomorrow, but I would imagine this puts them in an even tougher financial situation. I would think that they're above the second luxury threshold as far as the luxury tax, but again, I don't know that definitively at this moment, so we'll get back to you on that. But I like this move a lot for the Suns. I think that it adds a little bit of size, it adds a little bit of shooting, and David Roddy's a good player. He's been part of this hospital Grizzlies team that I've had so much fun watching the past few weeks, that he's been playing very well. He plays with a lot of heart, and I like him. The Milwaukee Bucks and Philadelphia 76ers made a deal, though, that was an exchange of Patrick Beverley going to the Bucks, and it was Cam Payne going to the 76ers. I like this move for the Bucks specifically. I think that Pat Bev is a little bit of that enforcer-ish type of guy, and he should be good to help with the defense. We've obviously been talking so much about the lack thereof with defense for the Bucks roster and how they need to solidify that. So I think that this is a nice little around the margins move. I'm not totally sure why the Sixers made this move. I don't know. You get Cam Payne, who provides a little extra scoring. I guess what I did talk about on the show earlier this week for where do the Sixers go from here, I think that the scoring aspect of this all was sort of where I'm most worried for them as far as staying afloat for the year to come. It's how do you replace those 35 points per game with no Embiid, at least for the time being, to try and keep your head above the water. Cam Payne can do some of that. It's not like he's any sort of an elite guy, but I mean, coming off the bench, I don't hate it for them. There's just a little bit more shot creation with Cam Payne, I feel like, in juxtaposition with Pat Bev. But, it's backup guard for backup guard, just sort of trying for both teams to add in areas where they are lacking. So a little bit of a lackluster move, but again, who knows, maybe this could come to be a little more significant. The I'll start actually, again, lots of trades going on here. The Dallas Mavericks, who I have also been talking about as far as I think that they should make a deal. They trade Grant Williams, Seth Curry, and a 2027 first-round pick for PJ Washington. PJ just signed an extension with the Charlotte Hornets. This is a former lottery guy. I believe he was in the lottery, if not just out of it, a few drafts back, but I think he's a really good player. He had a huge scoring output earlier this game. I think he had his career high. I'll check that as we go on the fly here, but one way or another, he has been a very solid two-way player for them. He can stretch the ball. He's got, again, he looks almost a lot to fill the role of what Grant Williams was supposed to do for them, but Grant had really been falling off from behind the 3-point line recently. And, he's a good energy guy. He seems to be a good locker room guy. He at least was with the Celtics. But I think that the Mavs are looking for a little more serious. That doesn't feel like a right word to use here, but they needed an upgrade, because when you invest into Kyrie Irving during the trade deadline last year, you aren't doing that just to sort of be fun and be good enough. It's because you think that Luka can lead you to a championship and you need to get him his running mate. And Kyrie and Luka have been incredible together when they've had the opportunity to play together. And I think that the Mavs offense is good enough to win them a couple playoff series potentially. But first off, they have to climb back into that race a little more. They are currently in the play-in tournament, I believe, but it also goes beyond just, again, being a fun potential playoff team. They are looking to win. They are currently the 8th seed, 28-23 in the Western Conference. And if they want to have any sort of real long-term hopes of winning a championship, they are going to have to put together a better defense that can sustain through, 4 rounds. And I like Grant Williams a lot as a Celtics fan, Grant coming from the Celtics, but this is probably a little bit of a disappointing year for him, where gets this contract with the Mavs, is expected to have a bigger role, more of contention, and now you're going to Charlotte where they are undergoing this rebuild. So we are going to take one last break here. It is 2:57, so we're going to close out this show right through the final minutes of the trade deadline. When we come back, we will have more on all of this. Stay with us. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Just started talking about the NBA trade deadline, but we are now 1 minute away from the official deadline. Going to be continuing to run through some of these moves. Now, I have a list of moves that went on prior to the show starting, but I guess I will get on top of right now some of the moves that have been taking place during the show itself, so I can be giving a little bit of gut reactions here. DeJounte Murray will not be traded from the Atlanta Hawks, so this is still an expiring contract. Going to be curious to see what they do here. I wonder, and this is just speculation again, a little bit of gut reaction talking here. I don't think that they can continue to fully move on with this DeJounte Murray, Trae Young backcourt. It would be a mistake for them to just let this contract run out with Murray and then not just let him walk and get nothing in return. So there have been a little bit of, rumblings about the idea of Trae Young's camp being unhappy and him potentially being on the move in time to come. There's been a fun fan theory, I think I would best describe it as, of him being traded to San Antonio, which I would love, because I've talked a few times on this show about the fact that I think that the Spurs need a point guard, a more legitimate point guard to put alongside Victor Wembanyama. So much is going on right now. The Celtics just made a trade for, it looks like, second round picks, so nothing too significant. But when I see Celtics make a trade, sort of throws me off my game a little bit. But is interesting to just see how the Hawks can plan to continue going forward with this. I mean, they're currently in the play-in picture, so not selling off here. They should probably see themselves in a similar position come the end of the year. Maybe they can end up making a run. I mean, they're the 10 seed right now, so it's not great. They are technically in the realm of it, but the Nets just sold off a little bit of their pieces, so maybe we see them start to fall more and the Hawks take more of a lead as far as that number 10 seed. But very interesting moving forward here with the Hawks of what their plan is. Going to try and stick to the script a little bit here. I know that Doug McDermott did just get traded from the Spurs to the Pacers. McDermott was previously with the Pacers. This appears to be just for a second round pick. So the Pacers sort of adding a little bit more of that 3-point shooting that they just sent out the door with the Buddy Hield trade. Still don't fully understand the Buddy Hield trade for the Celtics, but this is an expiring contract in Buddy Hield. Maybe you just felt like you had to get anything you possibly could for him, which is a couple second round picks. So who knows? Again, well, I'll have a chance to sort of go through some of these packages a little bit more and put together more refined arguments for all of these. The Jazz traded Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbaji to the Raptors for Kyra Lewis, Otto Porter Jr., and a 2024 first round pick. I actually, all things considered, I think that the Raptors were a little behind schedule in terms of putting together their rebuild, but they have put together a handful of pretty good young talent through these moves that they've made. I know they just had to trade a first round pick, and I'm not exactly sure what the protections or the specifics of that pick are just yet, but getting RJ Barrett, Emmanuel Quickly, I really like Ochai Agbaji. He's someone who really flashed. I believe he made an all-rookie team his first year with the Jazz last year. He was a late lottery pick. He was on the championship-winning Kansas basketball team a couple years ago and was their best scorer then. He has taken a little bit of a dip this year in terms of three-point percentage, but has also sort of seen less opportunities for himself because the Jazz are this weird middling team where they're kind of competitive, but they're also not that good. And their rookie guard, Keontae George, has came in, who I love Keontae George, out of Baylor. And maybe it's just a little bit of lack of opportunities when it comes to Agbaji, but just hasn't been quite the same necessarily. And I think now we can get a little bit of a fresh start here in Toronto. Kelly Olynyk being included in the deal is also a little interesting to me. Not exactly sure what the Raptors are trying to build here, but I think that this is just sort of a Danny Ainge thing, trying to, on the Jazz side of this, acquire as much, draft capital and such as he can. He didn't see Agbaji being a part of their future real significantly, so now instead sends him out the door and gets a first round pick. There were a couple of moves that we sort of went over yesterday, with the Celtics trading for Xavier Tillman from the Grizzlies. As this is sort of settled with me, I've liked it more and more just for the sake of being able to take some of the pressure off of Boston's big men who have been, whether it be load management or actually dealing with injuries between Al Horford and Kristaps Porzingis. just adding him to the rotation to come off the bench. He's a very good post defender. Doesn't give you a ton on offense, but I think that specifically for that defense, there was a lot of criticism when the Celtics moved on from Marcus Smart and Grant Williams in the offseason, especially Grant Williams specifically for the fact that he has been so crucial for helping to stop Giannis and Embiid in the past. Now you bring in Tillman, who has a very similar body type, is probably an even better post defender itself. So I think that this is a solid move for them, getting rid of a couple second round picks that don't mean all too much. The Timberwolves added a backup point guard. This one actually took place right after we finished the show. They trade for Monte Morris, who has just sort of been wasting on the bench for the Detroit Pistons. Monte Morris went there in one of these deals that the Pistons made this offseason that were just sort of supplemental moves, and they bring him in. I feel like the plan was always sort of to flip him in the end, and they didn't want him getting in the way of some of the guard development of Jaden Ivey and Killian Hayes, who was actually just released earlier today, which kind of came as a shock to me. Killian Hayes, it's funny because he had a decent game, but he started for the Pistons last night after requesting a trade a few days ago. He went 3 straight games with DNPs, and then he started last night because of this Monte Morris trade and all the moves that the Pistons have been making here. So, I don't know. It's interesting. Hayes, a former lottery pick in the 2020 draft. I think he went top 10. There's a lot of people who still have belief in him. I don't really, but frankly, I can't say I feel too strongly about him one way or another to say whether or not he can eventually be a contributor. It's very interesting the way that this whole NBA experience has played out for him. Really struggled with getting playing time early for the Pistons. Now he is a free agent, so we'll see what kind of role he gets with whatever this next team is. He's now, again, free agent, so he has his picks of where he wants to go next. We'll see what kind of future there is. Just kind of reading through some of these last moves here that I've missed. The Bucks, probably partially in due to this Pat Bev deal, they are sending Brook Lopez and cash to the Sacramento Kings, just trying to unload some of the money here. Robin Lopez, he actually started the other night against the Phoenix Suns because Brook Lopez was out. They were sort of struggling with bodies in that game. So he now goes to Sacramento, but is expected to be bought out. So who knows? There might be a rule that he can't go back on a buyout contract, but we will see. The Raptors have announced that they are going to be keeping Bruce Brown for the time being. There is a team option with his contract. It's worth about $20 million. So they have the option to move on from him this offseason, but he's been playing pretty good basketball. I feel like just full out declining it. I mean, we'll see what kind of direction the Raptors are trying to go from here on out, but they could probably get some value in him one way or another, whether that be keeping him and sort of helping him this experience. He's a big time glue guy, and he helps contribute to this now young Raptors team that is really trying to figure themselves out, or maybe even trade him. Again, we'll have to see how all of that plays out. But I think that is it for the most part on deals. There were 2 more deals, and then we'll probably wrap this up. There was a trade between the Brooklyn Nets and the Toronto Raptors, where the Nets send Spencer Dinwiddie to Toronto, and in return, they get Dennis Schroeder and Thaddeus Young. A little bit of a weird trade, but Thad Young coming back to Brooklyn. He was there a few years ago, I believe. Not really sure what this trade is about. I know that a lot of players and at least people in the front office with the Nets, or there was a report that came out saying that there were people that were thinking that Dinwiddie was like throwing games or going on strike. It was something along those lines. It hasn't been going well for Dinwiddie in Brooklyn this season, so he gets a change of scenery. The Nets still not totally sure what they're trying to do. I like Dennis Schroeder as a player. Thad Young is another, decent guy to have off the bench, an experienced veteran. So probably help to fill some of those minutes of Royce O'Neal, who he saw his way out. And then it was the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Charlotte Hornets agreeing on a deal, sending Gordon Hayward to Oklahoma City. This isn't exactly the deal I was looking for the Thunder, but I don't hate it. Gordon Hayward on an expiring contract. He's a good player. He's been very limited by injuries the past couple of years, including this year, but there might have been a little bit of the factor of the Hornets are just young and don't really want to clear space for some of their young guys to take over. I would expect we see Gordon Hayward healthier once he gets to the Oklahoma City Thunder. And Trey Mann and Davis Bertans were in the deal to return to Charlotte, as well as some draft compensation, and Micic, who was the European basketball player that they just signed from overseas this coming offseason. So, a whole lot of draft talk right there. We will sort of get to it in a more organized fashion tomorrow on the show. Just a reminder, the show will be taking place tomorrow at 8 p.m. as opposed to 2. So that is all I have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. And we will be back tomorrow. So have a good one.